All right, ice fishing rods. This last week I've been hit with a ton of questions on what rod do I use for this? What should I buy? I'm going to stop into a store. What should I look at? So I want to really touch on the different types of ice fishing rods and how they apply to different situations. I'm not going to bombard you with this brand or that brand or anything on that regard. You guys and gals out there can battle some of those wars, but I'll show you kind of what I'm using and why I use what I do. And hopefully this sheds some light on everything from panfish to the walleye side of things, catfish. I'm not going to jump into the lake trout realm a ton, but I really wanted to hammer down on the types of different rods, the actions, that sort of stuff, and why you would pick that rod. For starters, let's start with panfish. There's really three types of pan fishing rods, in my opinion, and then they vary from different kinds from there. But you have a spring bobber rod, you have a noodle rod, and then you have a graphite straight line jigging rod. So there's really three types for panfish, at least in the realm that I consider panfish rods. Like I said, you start with a spring bobber rod. And what is a spring bobber? I'm sure many of you are familiar with it, but if you're not, it just has a spring on the tip of your rod. So when a fish pulls down, that little nitinol titanium spring bounces and I can detect a fish. So spring bobber rods come in all different sizes and lengths. You can buy a spring bobber and affix it to an existing rod, so that's an option as well. Otherwise, a spring bobber rod's great for panfish because you can see that bite. You can not only see the aggressive bite, but the up bite. So a lot of anglers are gravitating towards a spring bobber rod, and I'm just fishing generally spring bobber rods with small profile jigs, small tungsten jigs, whether it's a drop kick or a standard drop or whatever it might be. I'm fishing a small profile tungsten jig, and I'm watching for those subtle bites. If it's a super aggressive bite, you might not need to go with the spring bobber rod, but most of the winter time, we're not dealing with highly aggressive natured fish. They're going to be a little more lethargic, a little less to bite. So the spring bobber is nice. So spring bobber is a great option to have in your panfish lineup. And again, like I said, they come in all different models and lengths and whatever else. And generally speaking, the rod is going to be an ultralight or a light action rod on that spring bobber, because again, you're targeting panfish, so you don't want a beefy pool cue if you're chasing bluegills and crappies and perch. So spring bobber setup, definitely one you want to consider, and I think it'd be a good one for your arsenal. I use spring bobber rods all the time. You can tell by the ugliness of the handle how much it's been used. So spring bobber setups, great option. Spring bobbers also give you a little bit of forgiveness, a little room for error, meaning if you're an aggressive jigger and that lure down there is bouncing all over the place, that spring bobber suppresses that movement a bit. So not only lets you see the fish, but it gives you a little bit of room for error if you're that really antsy ice angler. Tying kind of right in with spring bobbers, you have noodle rods, and you've probably heard that term often. A noodle rod is basically, there's no spring bobber on it, but on the tip, it's really quick. You can see how quick that tip bends. And generally speaking, the tip has a high vis color. This one happens to have high vis chartreuse. You see orange, I've seen pink, I've seen green. So same concept. When that fish bites, you can see that tip move. And again, different strokes for different folks. Some guys or gals prefer a spring bobber. Some guys or gals prefer a noodle rod. I use both. I like a noodle rod oftentimes if I'm fishing a spoon. So if I'm fishing a little bit of a small panfish spoon, like I'll always throw a 16th ounce spoon, that pinhead minnow has been my go-to for a couple years. I use a noodle rod for that versus a spring bobber. I have better success using a little heavier panfish jigs or spoons on my noodle rods, but you can certainly fish a tungsten jig as well. So just another option on what you would have for a rod type for panfish. You got the spring bobber and the noodle rod. Those are both your strike indicators. The way I fish them for strike indicators. I can also use this noodle rod, and when I lift that rod up, I can see there's a fish on there. They don't feel that weight, and I can set the hook. So a little more of a bend on this than your standard spring bobber rod. Spring bobber rod is going to be your typical, generally speaking, graphite rod with a spring tip. This is going to be more of a fiberglass rod with a more parabolic bend like that. So you have spring bobber rods, noodle rods, two options for panfishing. And then you have just your standard straight graphite jigging rod for panfish. And where that comes into play is if I'm using a heavier tungsten jig, I want to get that really erratic pounding action. I might be using a small Tikka minnow or a swimming lure, a jigging minnow type bait, and I'll use a straight graphite rod. Or if I'm going to, like I said, get really aggressive in shallow water, or I'm going to upsize my presentation. Most of the time I'm pan fishing, I'm using a noodle rod or a spring bobber rod unless I'm tight lining and watching the line. If you're a tight liner and your focus is on the line and that's how you train yourself, then you use a straight graphite or glass jigging rod. Otherwise, you have the noodle rod, spring bobber rod, straight graphite rod. Those are your three options. And generally speaking, we're looking at ultralight and light action for almost a majority of your panfish application. So once we get into that medium light realm, it has a very small niche area for your pan fishing, and you're talking more perch, small walleye type stuff. So that's your panfish setups. Next, you're moving to a medium light rod, like I just mentioned. Medium light rod is going to be probably one of your most versatile rods out there. So if you were going to buy one fishing rod to do it all, panfish to walleyes, it'd be a medium light rod. And why? It's just the right action to fish smaller spoons, all the way up to mid-sized spoons. You can fish a 16th ounce spoon, a 1/8 ounce spoon with a medium light rod, and you could get away with some larger panfish jigs. So you can see it's got a nice bend on it. It's not too stout, not too overbearing for if you were to land some perch or crappies or bluegills. Dave Gentz uses a medium light rod a lot to pound, size 10 tungsten and size 8 tungsten. And he's got that pound kicking motion, and he'll watch the line and watch that rod tip. So that has an application for everything from panfish to walleyes. And a medium light rod for me is going to be more of my, you can see there I got an 1/8 ounce Leech flutter spoon on there. It's going to be more of my mid-size spoon rod. It's going to be my workhorse if I'm perch fishing. If I'm doing large double XL jigs for walleyes on, let's say, Mille Lacs or Lake of the Woods or whatever it might be, and I might even fish a medium light rod if I'm fishing, that smaller to mid-size swimming lure, Tikka minnow, if I'm going to be chasing the perch, crappie, maybe walleye mix. And then that seems to be a great option. So medium light's going to be a versatile setup if you're looking to get the most bang for your buck with one setup. The way I do it is I prefer to have a walleye rod, a panfish rod. I try to really specifically focus, but I understand if you're up against the wall and you're looking for one setup, the medium light's probably the way to go. And then in terms of rod length's a common question. I prefer the longest rod I can get away with. So if you're in a smaller one-person fish trap, a shorter rod might be what you want. If you're up against a wall of a permanent fish house, a shorter rod. But if you can get away with a 30 or 32-inch medium light rod, to me that's a better bang for your buck and a better option out there to give your forgiveness at the hole, be more effective if you're hole hopping, if you're jigging, if you're setting the hook. I just think that longer rod gives you just that perfect, this gets me excited for ice fishing, that perfect bend on that rod. So medium light. So we're working our way up to, I'll talk a medium rod here now and why you would use a medium rod. Now you have a medium action rod. And this to me is going to be your more mainstay walleye specific, heavier action. And one thing we don't often think about, a lot of anglers walk into stores and say, I need a panfish rod, I need a walleye rod, I need a bluegill rod. The first question I always ask that customer if I'm talking to them is, what are you going to use? How are you going to fish? Because you really mimic the rod off of the presentation you're going to use. So just because I'm targeting walleyes doesn't mean I need a medium action rod. I've caught a lot of walleyes on light and medium light action rods if the presentation I'm using dictates that I use that rod. So if I'm going to be using a 1/4 ounce leech flutter spoon, a larger jig and minnow, like a larger Tikka minnow, then I'm going to be fishing a medium rod because I don't want that rod to flex when I'm working the bait. I want to have control of that lure. That's how you match the rod with the lure you're fishing. How does the lure work in relation to the rod? It's not necessarily always the type of fish you're targeting. So if I'm using a 1/4 ounce spoon, if I'm fishing, a more aggressive jigging minnow type bait, something of that nature, I'll probably use a medium action rod. So that's the time I'd use that. And again, rod length, same situation. If I can get away with a 30-inch rod, I'm going to do that. If I can use a 32 or a 36, great. So medium action rods are going to be more designed for larger spoons, your more aggressive swimming lures, that kind of stuff, because you don't want that rod to flex as much and you want to have more control and you want that hook setting power. Let's say if I'm going to drill this spoon home on a walleye's mouth in 33 feet of water on the mud flats of Mille Lacs Lake. So there's kind of your spectrum there. And then last but not least is a dead stick rod. And what a dead stick rod is basically, you can call it your game fish noodle rod. We talked about a noodle rod earlier. It's got that really quick tip, sensitive tip. You can see that rod bend when a fish bites. But a noodle rod or a dead stick rod, this is the dead meat rod, The reason I favor this rod a lot is because I have a super strong, look at that, I'm putting a lot of load on this backbone to drill home on a fish, whether it's a big crappie, a catfish, walleyes, you name it, even panfish. Some guys will use this as a dead stick rod for panfish. But the reason this excels as a larger game fish rod is because now I can see that fish bite, and I got the power to set the hook home. So anglers will set this on a rod holder at times and watch a minnow bounce that rod tip. You can see all that just moves with ease, and when a fish bites, it dips. They don't feel the resistance. But for me, I'm jigging with this. I'm fishing walleyes, I'm fishing catfish. So when a fish comes up on the Vexilar and sits over that bait, and I'm wondering if they bite, I work that rod up. And when that rod tip starts to bend like this, they got it. Set the hook home on them. So that's going to be your dead stick type rod. So that kind of rounds things out. We can go off on many tangents on each one of these, but that kind of gives you a pretty good idea of what you're looking at, from panfish, you know, up to medium light, medium action rods, dead stick rods, and maybe why you would pick each one. So think about how you're going to fish, where you're going to go, what you're going to target, the lures you're going to use, and then start to put the pieces together on the rod type that you want. So hopefully this answers some questions for you. By all means, ask some more questions below. I'll get back at it, and we'll get out there and chase some fish. It's cold out. You can see my breath here inside my garage in the middle of the day. So we're seeing these colder temps. They're starting to ice fish up north, but get out there, be safe, and let's have a great ice fishing season.